Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Philosophy Show YouTube channel, where Amos, Zweig, and myself were making video conversations about many philosophical issues and political issues, ethical issues, many interesting intellectual topics. And also, just so that the audience, those in the audience are aware, Amos and we recently participated in a debate about veganism and whether it's acceptable or justifiable to kill animals and eat them. So if you want to check out that debate, that's published on this channel as well, just one day before this one. So yes, just go there and look at the debate. It lasts 2 hours. So just to let you know that. So if you want to check that out, then go ahead. Okay, great. So we decided that the topic we're going to discuss today would be the idea of human dignity. So we could talk about the intrinsic worth or intrinsic value of human beings. Do human beings truly have such an dignity and inherent dignity? Or is it perhaps just an illusion or social construct or an instance of speciesism, as some would perhaps suggest? And how do we discover human dignity? Is it solely through Christianity, or can it be discovered through natural law as well? And all these are very interesting questions, which we thought we could discuss today. So Amos, I suppose we could start off by definitions. If you would like to define human dignity or human intrinsic worth or those things, and then take it from there.
Yes, thank you for the introduction, Christoffer. And yeah, I was starting to think about this definition, and I'm not sure if I can just do it myself in one swoop, but I think I can give a start. I think one characteristic that human beings have that animals seem to have to a much lesser extent or not at all is the capacity to feel shame, or to feel the opposite of dignity, to feel like humiliated or exposed. And because if you look at animals, they seem to do all kinds of bodily functions, no matter if other members of their species or human beings in a zoo are watching them. They don't seem to feel ashamed of certain aspects or functions of their body. But for human beings, I think this is a universal, that things like sexual intercourse or going to the toilet, or perhaps one or two other functions of the body, are human beings don't feel good to do these things when other human beings are watching. And also this idea that you wear clothes in order to cover your privates. I think this is unique thing for humans, and I think it has something to do with this notion of dignity or of humiliation that human beings have.
Well, that's a very interesting thought. I haven't really thought about that explicitly. I think the relation between the sense of shame and human dignity, because as you perhaps implied there, when human beings feel shame for having done something which that human being sense as being wrong, morally wrong, that could be a reflection of his dignity, because he realizes, oh, I have this inherent moral value or worth, and now I have offended it by some immoral action. And when you have shame, you sort of realize that you have offended your own dignity. But animals who, as I understand you're saying, don't have this particular kind of shame, or at least not to the same degree as humans, which would imply that they do not realize or acknowledge a special dignity that human beings have. Is that sort of your point, or have I misunderstood you?
Yes, I think this is sort of my point. also it's not just about feeling shame for having done something, but also just feeling shame like for, I don't know, for being seen, or yeah, being seen in a certain position or action, or having certain parts of one's body seen. So for example, if you were to, I don't know, lose your pants and stand with your privates exposed in some public place, then you would feel very much ashamed. And I think you mentioned in the beginning, before we started this conversation, the idea that human beings are made in the image of God. And as I was talking about this point with shame, I remembered that also in this very beginning of Genesis, there is this idea that human beings were ashamed of their nakedness and they hid themselves from God in that case, and then they started wearing clothes at that point. And so I think all of this is perhaps linked in some important way that we can find out.
Yeah, those are interesting points you brought up there. Yes, when you mentioned the phenomena of feeling shame when, as you say, perhaps some private part of your body is exposed in public, then you will truly feel, as you mentioned, shame, and you could also mention embarrassment, and just feel very, very bad and humiliated, you might also add. Now, I'm not quite sure exactly how to point exactly where that is a sign of you acknowledging a human dignity, because I can imagine some critics might just say, well, that's just because we fear other people's opinion, and we just have this fear, and that could be explained by simply our instincts or emotional structure or something like that, and not necessarily us realizing that we have a dignity being offended. So yeah, I can imagine critics might dispute that, but perhaps that's something you could address. Yes, and also the other thing about dignity and Christianity, which you sort of talked a little bit about there. It's very true. In Christian revelation, we have, as many in the audience probably know, God creating the first human beings, and human beings as such created in the image and likeness of God. Now we could talk more about, okay, what does it mean to be made in the image and likeness of God? What does that entail? Which are very interesting issues. And you also pointed out that before the fall of man, human beings, the first human beings, Adam and Eve, they were naked but not ashamed. But after the fall of man, and that was what you talked about, yes, then they felt shamed for being naked, and then God clothed them, and then they went out of the paradise. And there are also different theological explanations, I think, of exactly what made them realize their nakedness and be ashamed. And yes, that's a very interesting issue to think about. But yes, I'll let you address what I said.
Sure. Yeah, you brought up a couple of good points, and also I feel like I can't still yet fully grasp this definition of dignity. So I think we have to keep working on it a little bit. I would oppose the idea that it's simply an expression that human beings are afraid of other people's opinions, even though that seems to be generally true, that human beings have this fear that all or most of the people around them could have a bad opinion of them, because in the past, when human beings lived kind of more in a tribal state, this could easily be like a death sentence if everybody around you had a bad opinion of you. So I think this trend or this characteristic exists in human beings, but still there are certain actions or positions that are universally in all human societies being seen as humiliating or having dignity. So for example, standing upright, it seems to be associated with dignity, and having a person crawl on all four, either before or behind another person who is walking upright, seems to be associated everywhere with humiliating this person, because you are kind of having them act like an animal instead of like a human being, which is walking upright. And so there was this custom that, for example, when one king conquered another kingdom, then he would have the king that he conquered publicly humiliated in different ways. And one of them was to have him kneel in front of his throne and put his feet on the back of the king that was defeated, which is also, I think nobody would argue that this is just a subjective opinion of people, that this is humiliating, but this seems to be true for all human beings.
Interesting. Yeah, so you could sort of point out that humiliation involves some form of rebellion or offense against dignity, I suppose. Perhaps that could be going to the core of what humility is or what makes it bad. And perhaps a very related phenomena is just a person who's acting like a madman. Let's say you have a person who's going around in the streets and he's behaving like he is just a dog. He goes on all four and he makes all kinds of noises that dogs make and just acts completely crazy around in the street. And people would instantly recognize that he is doing something that is completely inappropriate, not simply because he's making noise and disturbing other people in the street, but that he is doing something wrong toward himself. Sort of a reaction where you think, what is this person doing? He's acting as if he is less than what he actually is. He's a human being, but he's acting as if he's just a mere dog, a mere animal. He's not respecting his human dignity. That is a very interesting thing to think about, that we have this reaction, and that this reaction is based on an acknowledgement of dignity. And we can see if someone disrespects his own dignity. So that's very interesting. And that might be evidence for us realizing we have dignity.
Yes, also, as you were talking, I thought humiliating another person always involves somehow making them look or act or seem like an animal. So it seems to be exactly the purpose of humiliation, or no, not the purpose, but the method of humiliation is always in some form to try to make a person act or look like certain behaviors or states that only animals take just in nature without thinking about, but that human beings actually feel uncomfortable about or avoid or feel shameful about. So also one idea is that you would let, again, let's take this king that was taken captive. You will the oppressor will not give him food for very long, and then when he gives him food, then he just starts eating like mad, and it looks like when an animal is feeding on something, or that you let a prisoner or a sick person not go to the toilet, so that they will end up kind of lying or sitting in their own feces. And this again is associated with humiliation, because and again, there are certain animals who don't really care about where or how they go to the toilet, like cows in a stable, they will just lie in their own feces. They will not think about to avoid having their feces on their legs or where they lie. And so, yeah, I think this really has something to do with the difference, the innate difference between human beings and all other animals.
Very interesting. Yes, several points that could be talked more about there. I would say that when it comes to humiliation, it's not, I wouldn't say it's the case that humiliation as such in all cases involve reducing man to an animal, but certain forms of humiliation involve that. Because you can have forms of humiliation where a person is humiliated without actually being treated like an animal. But in other cases, you could have that type of humiliation. And what's interesting is that it seems that people have a very, very, very high barrier for acting in that way or being treated in that way. It seems very painful for people to be treated as if they are an animal, even if no physical pain is done to them. Just the fact that they're being treated as if they are dogs, just as we have a person who's in a cage and he's eating as if he were a dog. For people, ordinarily speaking, that would be very, very difficult to live through. And one can ask, well, why? Why is it so difficult and painful for us to live that way? Well, it's because we know that that is not who we are. We are human beings. We have this special dignity. And it's just, we cannot sort of feel good about ourselves if we attack that dignity.
Yes, yes. I think I completely agree with what you said. And I was just thinking now, perhaps it has something to do also, or I believe that it has something to do with the evolution or the development of consciousness, that a human being can be can be conscious not only of his surrounding in the sense that he, for example, knows whether there is some dangerous predator around or whether there is some food or some water or whether it's hot or cold, but that human beings have this faculty of consciousness and also of being conscious of oneself, of perceiving not only the world, but also how do I look in the eyes of others? How do other people perceive me? So I have this this model or this knowledge in my mind of how I seem to others, and I have this idea or this sense of I, of ego. And of course, some religions and philosophies have said that this sense of ego is actually also the source of many or all of the problems of human beings or society. But still, I think that it's also unique for human beings, and it has something to do with this distinction between dignity and shame.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that reminds me, or I would say it's very related to the idea of personhood, the human person. Because some people would say, well, it's very interesting that human beings are personal. They're not things. When we talk about a human being, a human individual, we're not simply talking about what that human being is, but who that person is. The sense of personal identity seems also very related to this, that you are a person, an intelligent, intellectual, individual person, and not simply a thing. That seems also to be very connected to this idea of dignity. And it's natural for human beings to acknowledge this and understand that, yes, we have this unique dignity and unique personhood. And yes, when we talked about the I or the ego, one could say, well, this is based on this natural acknowledgement that we have. Now, then the question becomes, okay, how should we acknowledge it? And I think you perhaps implicitly implied that there is a danger of having pride or egoism, that you could view yourself too high, have an excessive acknowledgement of your own uniqueness or value, so that you develop pride and think that you deserve things that you might not actually deserve. So that's also something Christianity would say as well, that it's true, we human beings, we are made in the image and likeness of God, and that's great and beautiful and fantastic, and that's very natural to acknowledge. But at the same time, we should have humility, and we shouldn't turn this into pride. Pride is a distortion of this natural acknowledgement of dignity.
Yes, interesting points there as well. I like the idea that the problem is not the ego per se or the sense of I, but the exaggeration of the ego or the importance of the ego, and kind of seeing oneself as the top of the world, or as the most important, or kind of all-defining entity or measure of everything. And I think there is the problem, which I think was a very good observation that you made there. And also I think this idea that religions express in this sentence that human beings are made in the image of God. In my mind, I think it's very interesting, because I feel more, because I look at the world basically through a materialist perspective, that what happened is that through evolution, human beings at some point or in some time span have kind of started to evolve this faculty of consciousness. And we don't really yet understand how this works, but it seems just from everybody's personal experience, one can understand that this faculty exists, because I have this faculty of consciousness, and I assume that other human beings have it as well, and they behave as if they have it, and they get angry if I treat them as if they don't have it. And so we can assume that we have this faculty of consciousness. And I feel that this idea that human beings are created in the image of God, or some people have also said human beings have like a spark of divinity in them, is exactly related to this observation that we have this faculty of consciousness, and this is unique for human beings compared to other animals. And I also believe that the evolution of this faculty of consciousness has to do with this story that human beings at some point in time were not ashamed of their nakedness and basically lived like animals, but then started to have this feeling of shame of being naked. And to me, that all goes together with this idea or the faculty of consciousness.
Well, I would disagree with the evolutionary account of consciousness and the realization of dignity and shame and clothing. Now, I would, that being said, I will also add that the thing about the concept of being made in the image and likeness of God, consciousness is very close to what that entails, at least in Christianity. So perhaps I could present now very briefly, what does it mean to be made in the image and likeness of God according to Christianity? I think that St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest Christian theologians of all time, would say that what this entails is that we human beings have certain faculties which imitate certain intellectual features of God, or intellectual powers in God. And those would be chiefly or primarily the intellect and the will. So the intellect is our ability to understand concepts, abstract things, essences, or forms, you could say. So many people would translate that as the mind. The will would be our free will, that we are actually deciding to do something to reach a goal, and then our will directs our body so that we act based on our will. And this is something God has as well. He has an intellect and a will. And God's intellect and will are infinitely greater than human beings, because God is infinite and human beings are limited. But we see an imitation of God in that we have intellect and will. So that's what makes us unique, apart from other animals who do not have intellect and will. So that's why we have this interesting analogous relation to God, which animals do not. So that is what has been understood by the idea of being made in the image and likeness of God. Now, of course, I know that critics of Christianity and Christians as myself would have different accounts of how that came to be. For instance, there is this famous German thinker, Ludwig Feuerbach, in the 19th century, who maintained that God is a projection of human qualities, that we acknowledge we have certain virtues and qualities, and then we create God as an extension of that, as a supreme being who has our qualities to an infinite degree. So it's an invention from us. But I, of course, maintain that it's the opposite way around. That is God, and then he creates creatures which imitate him to more or less degree. So that was a brief presentation of the Christian view of being made in the image and likeness of God, and is the grounding of our dignity, you might say, at least to some extent. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for this brief introduction. I think it was very interesting, and the way I see the world is more akin to this position of Feuerbach that you have described. That I feel like human beings over time have realized that these capacities or characteristics that they have, which you have named, the intellect and the free will, are the fundamental things that set human beings apart from all other animals, because they have observed animals and they have observed themselves, and they have come to this conclusion that these faculties are unique for human beings. Just like, for example, I don't know, having wings and very good eyes is unique for birds of prey. And so that's why many thinkers have defined human beings as the rational animal. And then in my mind, it is more in this direction that human beings have then started to think about, okay, where do these faculties come from, or also what then would be the ultimate perfection of these faculties of intellect and will? Because yes, for example, if you are trying to make a bow and arrow, then you try to make the best bow that is possible. But also, if you think of how should I be as a human being, then you need a concept of what would be the perfection of this thing that we call humanity. And I think this is probably, in my mind, how the idea of God developed. Though on this question of that God created human beings and all other living things, I think there would also be an interesting topic to go in further, also from the religious and the evolutionary perspective, kind of in parallel. But yeah, I think that's just for now.
Yeah, those are points we could sort of discuss further. We would differ, of course, about God and the relationship between God and humans. But at least we see that both from religious perspectives or Christian perspectives and the perspectives of some who do not maintain the Christian faith, but still maintain that there is some dignity with human beings, they acknowledge the same reality, that there is a dignity, there is some value within human beings. And what is interesting is that you could sort of arrive at that conclusion both through divine revelation, that God has revealed this to Adam and Eve, and we can read about it in the scriptures, and it's taught by the Catholic Church, and also the way of philosophy or natural law, that we observe human beings, and we also have a certain knowledge about ourselves, and we recognize that there are some unique features that we have, intellect and will, that sets us apart from other creatures, and also that we have this personhood, and this gives us a very interesting sense of dignity or value. I would also add something that I argued in the vegan debate yesterday, which is that human beings are unique in that we are moral creatures. We are moral subjects, which you also maintained in that debate. We can make moral choices. We can choose between right and wrong. So our intellect is able to understand that something is good and morally praiseworthy or great, and that some things are immoral. And our will can act based on those conceptions. And we can thus realize moral goods, because moral goods are goods which are based upon a free will, the freedom of the will, that we can actually choose it. That makes it so fascinating and interesting and also beautiful, that actually we choose to do that which is good, even though we don't have to. And that sets us apart from animals who act based on instinct or emotion, but all of that is based upon some things that they have in their being, and they just act based on that. But we have a choice between different courses of action, and some courses are objectively better than others, and that we make choices about choosing the good course. That makes our actions and decisions have a moral significance and a moral character. So I also want to add that as a very important and fascinating and also beautiful dimension of human dignity.
Yes, I think that's a valuable addition, that the from the intellect and the will follows this capacity of human beings to make moral choices, and that the fact that human beings can and often do, though not perfectly, but still they try to strive towards that which is good, has, I think, something to do with this idea of human dignity. And also, I just thought of two more examples that seem to be very universal, I think, amongst different human societies. And these are both or three examples. One is the idea that when somebody dies, that you kind of have a ritual to bury them or to burn them or to do something like in a ritual manner to express. I think it has to do exactly with trying to express that this human being that has died here was not just a body or a piece of complex organized matter or flesh and bone, but there was also, as you said, a person or an individual, a unique human being with unique characteristics, and these characteristics are not the hair color and the eye color, but they are his character. They are parts of how exactly the intellect and the will, and perhaps some other, if there are essential things that make a subject or an entity, a human being, were expressed in this person. So there is the kind of the essential criteria or the essential attribute, which is intellect and will, but then these things also have a form, and the form can be slightly different. So my intellect doesn't work exactly the same as yours, and also a person's will can be influenced by different aspects of his personality or his character. And so I feel like these rituals that all human beings do when a person dies has to do with giving credit to this fact that this is also a kind of a moral or a spiritual subject and not just a piece of flesh and bone. Yeah, maybe let's leave it at that, and the other two examples later.
Interesting points you brought up. And yeah, perhaps I would bring in other factors behind the phenomena of funerals, but perhaps if we just leave that aside from the moment and address another, or bring up another point, which I also think is related to what you said. When we experience people dying, that is a very strong experience that can even lead to trauma. When you have people who go into war and they see human beings be killed, they instantly acknowledge that what is dying here is not a thing. And it's not just an animal, like, you know, when you have a pig being killed somewhere, you could say, well, that's sad, and emotionally that's not very comfortable to see. But when you see a human being die, a person with a face and a character and a personality and virtues, or at least have a capacity for virtues, and you see that person be killed or mistreated even, you will sense that, wow, this is really terrible, and there is something so bad and tragic and even traumatizing about this whole event. So I think that the reason why so many people who experience death and killing in war, soldiers, for instance, who travel overseas from America and then they come back and they have post-traumatic stress disorder, is because to comprehend that dignity of the human person being attacked so brutally, it's very hard to swallow that experience, you could say. But that's not, I don't think that's how people experience death of animals. If you go into a slaughterhouse, many people will probably feel, oh, this is very uncomfortable to look at, that many people will perhaps feel very bad for the animals. But I don't think you will experience this even traumatizing reaction as you might do when you see human beings be killed. So I think also here we see a sign of human dignity that we acknowledge, and we see this, we have this remarkable difference in reaction to when human dignity is attacked and when other creatures are attacked. What do you think about this consideration?
Yes, I think this is an interesting consideration. I'm sure that the vegans we have debated yesterday perhaps will experience this differently, but well, no, actually that's not true. They would just say it's also a big tragedy when animals are killed, but I would assume that they would have an even stronger reaction as well if they see millions of human beings being killed. And I think the reason why we experience this more gravely has to do again with this faculty of consciousness. And in Jewish tradition, there is this saying that every human being is a little world of himself or in himself. And I think this has to do with the fact that just the human mind, the human consciousness, there is so much details and minutiae and character and individuality associated with it, that it's really, you really feel this uniqueness of the characteristic of something being unique. I think can be most strongly felt in relation to another human being. So for example, when I contemplate the fact that my wife could die when she, for example, goes out of the house in the morning, she could be run over by a car. And then I'm always struck by how irreplaceable this other human being is, because they are so unique with so many different attributes and characteristics that are a part of their consciousness, that the consciousness seems really extremely large in a sense.
Yeah, I wouldn't put it in matters of quantity, but rather in matters of quality, that there is a qualitative faculty of consciousness that makes us qualitatively different from humans. But that being said, it's very true that we see human beings have these qualities: consciousness, intellect, will, personality. Even just by looking in someone's face, just by looking at their face and comprehending it, you see that this is a human person, and that's a unique thing to behold or acknowledge or contemplate, as you say. And that's very true, that individual human persons are irreplaceable. It's you cannot repeat the same individual person. And I think some philosophers have tried to come up with this hypothetical question of, okay, well, what if you make an artificially intelligent robot that tries to imitate a specific individual person as best as it can, almost complete identical, have all this machinery and programming to make it say exactly what that specific human individual said, and all sorts of things, same voice, etc. Would we acknowledge that robot as a person and have this dignity? Would we experience that similar to when we talk to and interact with human beings? And I would say no, because there's just a machine, there's just a robot. There isn't this form that animates us human beings, which involves these unique intellectual capacities. And also one point about the face. The face is a sign of our individual personality and our unique dignity, you could say. There is this old saying that the eyes is the window of the soul. And yes, I think that's an expression, also expression that the face is the representative of the soul. So the face itself will make you instantly understand this is a person. And I think this is metaphysically impossible to do when it comes to robots and machines, because all you have are simply mechanical parts that are materially organized, but you need the form and the intellectual powers and this personhood, and you can never create that by mechanics, to put it that way.
Yes, I think this question of of the artificially intelligent robot, how should I say? I think it's an interesting thought experiment, and if it were possible to create an entity which looks and behaves exactly like a human being, but is internally made of some other substance or combination of materials, then perhaps a human being could mistake this entity for another human being and experience it as if it has a personhood or an ego or a character or something. But I think that this is it seems to me that this is impossible to do, because a human being and other animals as well, for that matter, are so optimized, I would say, by evolution, that they cannot be, you cannot copy or reproduce the same result with another internal structure. It's like saying, I don't know, I have a normal bridge is made out of steel and concrete, but can you make something which looks just like a bridge and acts just like a bridge, but is made out of wood? No. Well, there are, of course, bridges made out of wood, but they look different than a bridge made out of steel. And the reason is that steel has a more strength in it per cross section than wood, and so you cannot build the same structure out of wood than you do out of steel, because it would just break. And this was, I think, not the best example, but what I'm trying to say is that if you wanted to build a robot that acts and is really indistinguishable from a human being, then this robot would also have to be internally built just like a human being, and it would actually be a human being. So I don't think that you can copy the external with different internals, because it's too well optimized. That's, I think, my point.
Interesting. Well, this could get into some deep metaphysical thinking, but perhaps if I could share some thoughts. One could go back to this old Aristotelian distinction between form and matter, that human beings are made up of matter, and we also have the form, which organizes the matter into the kind of thing that we are, which is human beings. And we could perhaps say somewhat of the same of the individual human person and that person's unique personality. That person's unique personality is not merely the sum of the material parts. There is something unique, a unique form that all the parts are organized into. So this form has some independency from merely being the sum of material parts. And here I think we see a metaphysical impossibility of therefore trying to create that very same personality by means of, for instance, machines, because you cannot create the form by just having the parts. You have to have the form and the parts together. That goes again back to Aristotelian holomorphism. So I think that's a very interesting metaphysical point to think about. And yes, when it comes to mistaking robots for persons, yes, I think if you have a robot, a machine in the room, and you don't really look them in the eyes, to put it that way, you simply hear the noise and you are distracted and do something else, I think, yes, you could mistake that for a person. But when you truly look carefully into that robot's eyes or face and truly try to contemplate that, I think you will never be able to grasp it as a person. So I think there's an interesting phenomenon there that is relevant to, again, the concept of human value and human dignity. So that's also a point. Also, another point I also wanted to bring up, which is not that much related to this, but it's related to the idea of human dignity in generally, and the intellect and the will. This human dignity is shared by everyone who is a human being, even if there are some individual human persons who are not able to fully actualize all the intellectual capacities which are due to us or due to our human nature. And I think, I remember you said that individual human persons exercise their intellect and will in different ways to a certain extent. There are certain accidental phenomena connected to that, even though there's an essential element, of course. And then we have infants, and we have people who are severely mentally handicapped. Those will have challenges that other human beings will not have. Infants will not be able to make moral choices or think very intellectually abstractly. However, they still have that human nature, they still have that human substance, and that human substance has within itself the potential to make moral choices, the potential to have this intellect and the will, and that potential will be actualized or realized gradually over time as that infant matures and becomes older and older. And I think it's important to recognize that since the intellect and the will and that human personality are grounded in human nature, that means that it is the human nature itself, the human substance itself, which becomes valuable. And also, I would say, as in the vegan debate, morally significant, because it is this particular kind of being which is the grounding and foundation for all our moral choices. So even if you have an infant or a severely mentally handicapped person, not being able to exercise these fantastic unique features, they still have the same human substance or human nature, which is itself morally significant. And that's why all human beings have that fundamental dignity. And also the same basic rights like the moral right to life.
I will attempt a kind of, I have to follow a thought which I'm not yet fully sure where it will lead, but I think it is very connected to what you have just said. So the way I think about it just now or at the moment is that as we have discussed yesterday, there are certain human beings, though all human beings have by their nature the potential to develop intellect and will, which are these essential human characteristics. Still, perhaps some are infants and some are perhaps handicapped in a certain sense, that this the actualization of this potential either hasn't happened yet or is blocked by something. And I would say that in the perception of all the adult human beings who have intellect and will, these children and mentally handicapped people are in fact not moral agents. They are also at this point in time only subjects of morality. And only when they have actualized their intellect and their capacity for will, then they will also be moral agents. And I also feel that, for example, very small children and also mentally handicapped people also don't seem to share this sense of dignity or of shame that we have talked about in the beginning. So, for example, babies don't care when they poop, they just poop. And at some age, I don't know exactly, I think between 2 and 4, children will start to feel ashamed and they will hide in some corner when they have to poop. And then at some point they even learn to control it, and then they can go to the bathroom. And I think the same thing is for very mentally handicapped or degenerated people. They lose this ability again to feel shame for certain body functions. And yeah, so I do see a parallel there. And the way I see it is that human beings who have intellect and will and are moral agents and have this feeling of unique dignity of human beings compared to all other things, it is through their action and through their desire or striving that they give, not give, but acknowledge, for example, the right to life or the dignity of every human being, even if this human being at this point in time does not yet have the potential of intellect and will actualized.
Yeah, you brought interesting considerations, but I'm not sure if I fully grasped the specific point that you were trying to make. So could you sort of formulate the point very briefly?
Yes, I will try. The point is, it has to do with the argument that we already made in our first video about veganism, that the reason why it is wrong to torture animals unnecessarily is because of the effect that it has on the conscious human being who is a moral agent who does the torturing. And I would maintain the same point about the right to life and the dignity of other human beings who are either handicapped or still very young infants, that the reason we acknowledge for these human beings also the right to life or the the possession of a human dignity is not because of them, because they are not moral agents and cannot in that sense protest or desire this, but it's because of us who are actually moral agents and who realize the great tragedy that it is when, for example, a human being is killed.
Okay, and now I see your point. I understand your point, but actually I would differ on that issue, because I would say that the human being itself, that is an infant or severely mentally handicapped, has this moral unique significance in his very being or substance because of the potential for moral choices and intellect and will, as I explained. And therefore, moral rights will still be present, because you could sort of think of the inherent potential for moral capacity, intellect, and will. You can view them as treasures within that human nature, treasures or gifts. And then the question is, okay, how do you use that treasure? How do you get into it and actually use it or praise it or whatever you're going to use with that treasure? That is perhaps the actualization of those unique features. But the fact that the being itself, that substance itself, has that potential within itself, makes that being very unique and valuable and morally significant. And you could sort of look at it as a treasure. So when you look at an infant, you could say that, okay, this is not a moral agent because that infant is not making moral choices. But just the fact that that infant is potentially a moral agent in the future, or at least has the potential for moral agency in his very being, is enough to make that infant be so morally significant that it has the right to life, for instance, because the moral rights protect your inherent gifts or treasures, even if those treasures or gifts are not actualized or used or exercised. And that is different. That is a difference between infants and animals. So that's why you could say that animals do not have this inherent moral right to life that is thus being violated, even though, as we agree, animal abuse is wrong. But there is a difference between abusing infants and abusing animals, in that infants has this unique moral significance that animals do not. So I would actually have a different metaphysical or metaethical view there.
Yes, interesting. I would like to go a little bit more into defining this term moral significance. I think that would be helpful, because I think at the moment, this is a point where we would have a disagreement, that I feel rights is kind of come from conscious agreements, or not come from, but is an expression of a conscious agreement of moral agents, whereas you feel that the right to life, for example, comes by fact of being human, because this, let's say, small child has the potential to develop intellect and will, and thereby moral agency in the future. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think you have it correctly.
Yeah, so perhaps you could, or we could try to find out what this term moral significance means. So what's your first thought there?
Well, that's a difficult question to define moral significance. Yeah, I would sort of say it is about the human nature itself, the human essence or the human substance itself being valuable, morally valuable. It has an inherent moral value. Just very briefly, for those who might be confused what I mean by essence, I'm talking about the traditional Aristotelian or Thomistic view of essence, that essence is that which makes a thing be the kind of thing it is. So we human beings have human essence. A tree has the essence of a tree. An elephant has the essence of an elephant. So it is that in your being that makes you the kind of being that you are. And all human beings as such necessarily have human essence or human nature, because that is what makes them human being in the first place. And all human beings, infants, mentally handicapped, and adults, have human essence. Okay, so that essence becomes valuable in itself because of its potential to have intellect, will, moral agency, moral choices. So you could, I would say that you could view the essence as, yeah, perhaps you could say the essence itself is a treasure, and a treasure contains all these wonderful gifts: intellect, will, moral agency. But in the very early stage of childhood, when you are an infant, for instance, you have all these gifts simply locked deep down in that treasure. They are not opened and taken out and shown up out and used, but they're still there. So the treasure is valuable, it's significant, because it contains all these wonderful gifts, even though they are potential in the sense that they are simply contained there. They're not opened and used, i.e. being actualized. So when it comes to moral rights then, and this goes back to the earlier discussions we had about moral rights, what they are, how we should understand them philosophically. Perhaps this is a disagreement between us as well, but you could of course clarify that moral rights, ontologically speaking, ontology is the idea of existence. How does moral rights exist? In what way can we talk about moral rights being out there in reality? I agree that moral rights has an element or a dimension of social recognition in society. Moral rights become relevant in society because it's about you and I respecting rights. However, when it comes to the moral rights themselves, how do they exist metaphysically or ontologically? I would say that they arise from a nature that is valuable because it contains all these gifts, even in potentiality. So the moral rights arises automatically or naturally or directly from that valuable substance. So in the case of infants, therefore, they have a moral right to life, not because they are capable of making more choices, but because they have a nature within themselves with the potential to have these gifts of morality and moral agency and intellect and will. And thus they have the moral right come out of that automatically, and which gives everyone as a duty to respect it. So yeah, I hope I managed to sort of clarify my own view on the issue. Yeah. So.
Yes. It was, I think you presented it well, and it was interesting to listen to, but it's kind of almost too big to grasp it all at once in my head, I feel. So I think one thought that stuck in my mind, and perhaps this is a good point to start here for me to unravel this question, is the idea of the inherent value of human life, or I would even say the inherent value of life in general. So the way I feel it is that life itself has like an inherent value just in itself. Life is a good thing. It is better that there are living beings than if there were no living beings. And then I would say the same of consciousness again, like as a step up, or even perhaps if you want to go with Aristotle, you could say there is like vegetative life, which covers all of the plants. And then there is animal life, which is like a step up from the vegetative life. And then there is rationality or consciousness, which is another step up from animal life. And I feel all three of these steps or categories have an inherent value in themselves. And I can't really prove that. I more just kind of feel it as an axiom. It's just something of which I am convinced, but perhaps this feeling that life in itself and then animal life and then consciousness has an inherent value just by the fact of existing, it is something good. This has also to do perhaps with our feeling or experience of moral significance. And that's perhaps why we attribute a higher moral significance to a human life than to an animal life, and perhaps also a higher moral significance to the life of another mammal than to the life of an insect. And then there come plants and trees, and then there come immaterial objects like stone and sand and iron and all that stuff. So what do you think of that?
Very interesting points. Yeah, so I would comment about when it comes to this hierarchy of being, that you have inanimate objects, then you have vegetation like plants, and then you have animals and human beings. That's a very beautiful hierarchy of being. I thought that was a great way of looking at reality by Aristotle, and then recognize this the beautiful order in the universe. Yes, so I would perhaps you could distinguish between a general value or ontological value, that is, something has value insofar as it exists. I think Saint Augustine said that everything is good so far as it exists. Its existence itself is a metaphysical value. It's good to exist. And then there are different qualities that you can have. Being vegetation, like plant, is a better thing than being merely a stone, because you have a higher qualities. And then animals are better than vegetation again, because that has even more unique or higher qualities. So there are, you can say, a hierarchy of value. Now, when it comes to human beings, we have even a higher value, and that value is so great and significant that it has a moral significance. It is a moral value. And the reason why that is true for human beings, specifically that we have a moral value, is because in our very being, in our very nature, we have the capacity to make moral choices, or what we put it, perhaps even better to say, we can realize moral goods. Because if you look at all amoral things, inanimate objects, vegetation, and animals, they can do all sorts of things which can be generally called good. An animal might give food to her offspring. That's a good, generally speaking. And a flower will grow and become fully grown. That is a good for the flower, but there is no morality there. There are no moral goods there. There are simply goods in a very general or genetic, I think one can say, sense. Human beings can actualize moral goods, moral virtues, which are virtues such as prudence, temperance, justice, chastity, patience. These are goods, not merely things that are good for our nature, but goods that we choose to acquire. We make free choices about them. And that's why they have a moral character, because they are freely chosen, not simply done out of instinct or emotion. So because of our inherent ability to make moral goods, our nature itself gets a moral value, which from then arises moral rights. So I hope I managed to present my view well here so that you understood.
Yes, I think you presented it well, and I think it's very interesting, and I will just try to work it out a little bit in my mind. So you could say that since only human beings can have this capacity to realize moral goods, then only human beings can have a moral value or a moral significance. I think that's your point. And like an animal can realize, if you want, animalistic goods like procreation or feeding or moving somewhere or avoiding to die. And so only animals can have animalistic value. And then you could say plants can grow and have a what's this called? Like metabolism. And so only plants can have a vegetative value, well, and all the other higher forms. And then there are stones or inanimate objects, and they can only just have the value of simply existing. So there is like the higher you go on this ranking of something having inherent value, then there are different categories. And so you cannot say that a plant has animal significance, and you cannot say that an animal has moral significance, because moral significance only applies to things that can realize moral goods, and these are, to our current knowledge, only human beings.
Right.
Very interesting line of argument, and quite fascinating. I would want to compare it to another way how you can understand moral significance, and that would be, for example, let's say if I steal your property, let's say I steal your food, and then you can no longer eat, then this will in the end lead to your death. And so I am violating a right of another moral agent, and thereby the object, the food, has a moral significance because it is necessary to maintain the existence of this moral agent. But I guess from this overview that I have just summarized before, you would actually say, no, the food doesn't have moral significance, it has animalistic or vegetative significance, because it is significant to maintain a functioning metabolism and to stay alive as an animal, but it's not in that sense significant for a moral good in itself. But what do you think of this?
Yeah, I would say that food are not in itself morally significant things. They are amoral, morally neutral in their being. Now, it's true that food is necessary for human beings to live and survive and flourish here on Earth. So in that sense, you can say that we human beings have a moral right and even a moral virtue, moral duty to eat food, not because the food in itself is a moral good, but because it's necessary for us and we are morally significant. So yes, there are rights and duties connecting to us eating food, but it's not about the food in itself, if that makes sense.
Yes, but wouldn't just trying to figure it out very clearly, wouldn't that be associated actually with the level of being an animal, because all animals eat food, and so the eating of food would actually be an animalistic value and not a moral value?
Yeah, I suppose you could say that, because when we eat food, that is good and valuable insofar as we are material, okay, if you can use that term, animals. And qua animals, or insofar as we are animals, we need food for nourishment. Now,
yes,
there is this discussion of, okay, should you categorize humans as animals or not? To me, that's not a very important question, because we could just use that term anyways. Right, so
if I may, you could then say, sorry for interrupting, you could then say that which is morally significant for a human being is to continue his existence as a moral agent.
Right.
That is, the existence of the moral agent is morally significant, or is a moral value. And the eating of food is, of course, necessary aspect of that, but that is actually just a function of being an animal. But the continued existence of the moral agent, that is the morally significant thing.
Right, yes. So you could sort of say that the eating of food is morally relevant indirectly. It is morally relevant insofar as we need it to keep on existing, which is a moral duty, you could say.
Yes, yes. I think this seems very, very neat and logical to me, and in this framework of the Aristotelian, and I think many other cultures have seen this as well, that there seems to be this hierarchy between inanimate objects and then plants and then animals and then human beings. But yeah, I think this is has cleared up many things for me in this sense. So now I'm just trying to think to tie this all back to the question of human dignity where we started. I think that will be an interesting task, and yeah.
Yes, that's a very good task. So I suppose we could say then that human beings, we have dignity. In other words, we have an inherent moral value or moral worth. That moral value or moral worth is not accidental. It's not there simply by doing something. It is there essentially. It is grounded in our very being, in our very nature. Human beings, qua human beings, in other words, human beings, so far we are human beings, have this dignity. Now, how can we say that? How can we philosophically argue or defend that thesis? Well, we human beings, we have intellect and then we have will. We can grasp abstract concepts or essences or forms, and we have free will. We can choose things based on that abstract understanding. From there arises the capacity for moral choices. In other words, to realize moral goods. When we make a moral choice, we have this intellectual capacity to distinguish between right and wrong. So our intellect is exercised in a good way. And then we have the will, which acts based on that conception or comprehension. So the intellect knows what is good, what is bad in a specific context, and the will acts towards that which is good, informed by the intellect, and thus realize moral goods, such as when a person does justice to another person, pays back a loan that he owns a person, or that person, you could say, respects property rights, or does something that is good, or just has some virtues like prudence, temperance, fortitude, justice, etc. Then those are moral goods, because he uses his intellect, his will, to realize these things. And that capacity for moral choices is inherent in our nature. Potential, it exists as a potential, as a gift that is within that treasure, which we call the human substance or human essence. So our very human substance or very human essence is morally valuable, morally significant, has the dignity, because it has the inherent potential for the intellect and the will to realize moral goods, such as these moral virtues I mentioned. So that would perhaps be a brief explanation of the view which I've been arguing for.
Yes, I think this you put this really beautifully, and very very good summary of many points that we have been talking about. And I was asking myself as you were talking, would you say, or would we say that dignity is kind of synonymous or kind of just expressing the fact that a human being has an inherent moral value, or is the inherent moral value, as you said, by essence, by the essential characteristics of being a human being, is that one of many or more than one aspects of this concept of dignity?
I would say that this moral value within a nature is the same as the human dignity.
Yes, and then perhaps these things which we have talked about in the beginning, like having a certain sense of shame for certain body parts or functions, or for example, wanting to walk upright or wanting to eat in a civilized manner or not living in a cage and being fed by other human beings, that would kind of be the bodily expression of this fact that a human being has an inherent moral value because it has these unique capacities, namely the intellect and the will. And this would kind of be expressed through certain physical behaviors, and therefore a human being would feel kind of hurt or ashamed or humiliated if he is not able to behave in this manner that kind of corresponds to this perception that he has intellect and will.
That's an interesting point. I would say that when you experience this humiliation, which we were talking about earlier, you recognize, oh, I am somewhat, my dignity is offended, my moral value is offended. And you recognize that I, as a human being, that human essence or human nature or substance which I have within myself is attacked here. And I know for a fact, I know intrinsically that I have a valuable, morally significant human essence. And it's very bad for me to feel that being. But yeah, sorry, you were about to say something?
Yes, I was just wanting to clarify, to go a little bit into this point, because how exactly is my moral value offended if, for example, I am forced or just standing naked in a public place? I still have my intellect and I still have my will. So how is then my moral value or my moral capacity offended or diminished?
That's a good question. And I sort of comprehend why that is and the logical reason for it, but I'm not sure if I can argue for it very briefly because it's deep metaphysical things. But perhaps I can put it this way: when you have someone with this moral dignity, this moral value, that's from that flows a certain respect and way of treating that person with that dignity in a good way. And whether you respect to disrespect your dignity can happen in various ways, even if your intellect and will are not directly attacked. It can be indirectly offended because the human nature with the intellect and will is grounded in is not respected appropriately. And okay, then people might ask, okay, well, what do you count as appropriate respect and inappropriate disrespect of human nature? Well, perhaps this is something that people can dive more into, but I'm at least thinking of the same principle in other examples. For instance, let's say that you are going to meet the king in your country. There's a king and you're going to meet him. And you could say that the king has a dignity by virtue of being king. That dignity sort of implies, even if it's just implicit, but you sort of know that, oh, you're going to meet the king, the very king of your own country. You should dress well. You shouldn't go there in caps and a vulgar sweater. You should go very well dressed. If you don't go very well dressed, you are disrespecting the dignity of the king. Even if you're not out there attacking his authority, even if you're not disobeying him in any way in his authority, you're still disrespecting his dignity as king by going up there and dressing very badly. Or let's say you are using curse words against your mother. That would be offending the dignity of your own mother by doing that. Not because necessarily you are, well, you could say you're sort of disobeying her if she has a rule that you shouldn't curse to her, but you're disrespecting her dignity as a mother by doing these things. So I would use that as examples of the principle that you can disrespect dignity by virtue of not doing things which are appropriate in a specific context. So yes, I'm not sure
if I may. Yes, no, I think your examples make sense, and I have an idea how to perhaps formulate the principle behind it. And it seems to me that, as we said, there is just existence in itself, and then there is vegetative, animative, and rational or moral kind of aspects of a human being, or as Aristotle put it, there are a vegetative, an animalistic, and a rational part of the soul. So, which I think is the same idea. And I think, for example, the fact that we, for example, don't go to the toilet publicly, but we do that privately, or that we use clothes to cover our private parts, or that we, these things mainly, I think this has to do with trying to put the rational part, or the rational aspect of human beings into the forefront, and to put the animal aspect of a human being kind of in the background, to kind of put a couple of layers of, or barriers between the very animal aspects of the existence of a human being and the outside world where other people can perceive me. So it has to do with putting the focus of how we perceive each other onto the specifically human or rational or moral aspect of a human being, and not, for example, on the animalistic aspect. What do you think of that?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I fully grasped your argument here. Could you again formulate it very briefly, so I'm sure that I understood it?
Yes, I will try. So let's say if you are so a human being has, let's just say, an animal and a rational aspect to itself. And you can either, in certain interactions, the animal aspect is more in the forefront, and in other interactions, the rational aspect is more in the forefront. And I feel like these things, like, for example, being dressed when you are out in public, even though it doesn't hinder the use of my intellect or of my will, when I stand there naked and everybody sees my privates, then there is more focus on the animal aspect of me, like the ability to reproduce and having a digestion and having to go to the toilet and these things. Whereas if you wear clothes and you cover these things up, then the focus is more on me being a moral agent or a rational being with intellect and will. So you shift the focus on that which is specific to human beings.
Wow, that's a very great point. That's a great argument. That's
Thank you.
Very good. Yes, I agree. I think that, as you sort of pointed out, our human nature has two aspects: animality and rationality. And I would put it this way, that there should be an order between animality and rationality. The rationality is the highest or noblest part of our essence or human form or nature. And animality is below that, even though both are there to be human essence. And when you are uncovering some private parts, or that is happening in the public, your animality is taking the place of the rationality. So there is a disorder. There's an inappropriate relation between them. There's not a legitimate hierarchy. And thus your dignity becomes disordered or challenged or attacked in that way.
Yes, and I would say, even though human beings acknowledge that they also have this animalistic aspect to their existence, still every human being primarily wants to be perceived as a moral agent or as a rational being. And the animality, even though it is also an important or essential aspect of our existence, it should be kind of, it's kind of subordinated, and we want to be primarily perceived as moral agents. And this is actually also a point that Jordan Peterson always says, that human beings perceive themselves and want others to perceive them as moral agents who are capable of making moral choices. And if you do not view them in this light, then they get very angry. And I think that's for a good reason, as we have discussed here.
Right, exactly. That's very true. We see so many people who criticize others for not respecting them, their person. We have also this phenomena of objectivization, that you focus more on the body than, you could say, the soul of the person. So that's another way to put it, that people want to acknowledge the spiritual part of their essence more than the bodily part of their essence. And when that is not done, that's bad.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's very true. And this is a good example, this idea of objectivization, when you just look at, for example, a woman as basically an object that can give you sexual pleasure, or vice versa, when a woman just looks at a man as kind of a food provider. That is, it is deeply offensive to this person, because they themselves, in their deep within them, they perceive themselves as moral agents and not simply as animals. So
so if you have a person who denies that this other person is a moral agent and can make more choices and have this dignity, then yes, that can be experienced as very bad. That's very true.
Yes, and even though I don't want to ruin the close of this conversation, which is right now just perfect, but just a brief addition. No, I forgot it.
Oh, too bad.
Maybe we can cut this pause, because just 1 second. It's not. We said that you shouldn't objectivize people because they are moral agents. I feel like it was important, but now it's not coming back. Too bad. Perhaps
some metaphysical consideration about the nature of human beings, or some particular application thereof.
It was an application of this thing that we have found here, kind of applied to human relationships, like romantic relationships.
Okay, yes. Well, it's very fascinating to think that this metaphysical principle is applicable to so many everyday practical circumstances. So once again, we say that philosophy is very relevant to practical life. There is another point I also wanted to mention, if that's okay. And in addition to this fundamental human dignity that all human beings have by virtue of their human essence, there is something I could call social dignity. And this is different from, the human beings have different degrees or levels of social dignity. So that are dignities that are not related to you as a human person, but your role or position in the family or society as a whole. So when you are in a court and you have the judge coming in, that judge, by virtue of being a judge, has a dignity, which is something you acknowledge and respect by rising up and not sitting down, standing up and not sitting down when he gets into the room, and you're not disrespecting the court. That's a very huge offense. And as we mentioned earlier with the example of the king, by virtue of being king, he has a very high dignity. You should respect that, and you should treat it when you meet him. That should be a solemn occasion, not a casual occasion. And also there is social dignity that parents have, that children have to respect. The same goes for, I would say, bishops when it comes to Catholicism and all that. Priests and bishops have a dignity by virtue of being that you have to respect. So that's also another element of the dignity that is in addition to human dignity. And I find this topic to be very, very interesting as well.
Yes, I think that is a good point that you brought up there. I think the way I perceive it, I would want to add a clarification, and that is that not the judge or the king itself as a human being is deserving or receiving this dignity in a good social organization, but it's the role of the judge or the king. Because this role is important for a society, and therefore you should not disrespect this role or this institution, I think we would call it today, because certain social institutions are important and you should not disrespect them. But at the same time, the judge or the king or whoever it happens to be should also be very careful not to confuse his own personal dignity or value with the dignity or value of the social role. And he should, of course, also not offend against the dignity or importance of this social role himself. For example, by being corrupt, which would be an offense against the institution that he is now in the position of representing.
Yes, exactly. So we could say that in a king, for instance, insofar as he is a human being, he has this human dignity. Insofar as he is king, he has this social dignity of a king. And yes, as you said, if you have a corrupt, immoral king, then he is offending the dignity of his subjects. And yes,
I would put it slightly different. I would say that the king, that he is offending the dignity of the institution of king, like the social institution of monarchy.
Yes, I completely agree. That's a very good point.
Because he himself is just a human being like all the others. He is not more dignified than all the others. It's just that he is kind of like in this role, like an actor plays a certain role, but he does not own this role or the dignity associated with the institution of monarchy. He is just the person who is acting out this part or filling this role at this moment.
Right, yes. I would put it this way, that the person who is king, that person is socially dignified insofar as he occupies a throne. Or in other words, you could say that he borrows the dignity of the kingship or the monarchy for a specific amount of time.
Yes, I mean, you can look at it that way. I would disagree and rather look at it the way I have presented, but I think we do agree that certain social institutions also have a dignity which comes with the fact that they are very important for the existence of society.
Right, exactly. And this distinction between the dignity of the social role and the dignity of the person himself is an important one. And I think also that's a good argument for some conservative philosophies, because it seems that some liberals and left wings will identify the wrongdoings of a specific monarch or some other person in position with the wrongdoings of monarchy or the social position itself, and thereby criticize and perhaps even condemn those authoritative positions. But there is a distinction
Yes.
there, and that's very important.
Yes, very, very good point here to really pin this down. And you can say exactly the same of anarchists, which both you and I at some point in the past subscribed to this idea of anarcho-capitalism. And I would say just the same, that anarchists confuse the bad actions of individual human beings in government with the dignity or the function or purpose of a government as a social institution in itself.
Right, exactly.
Yes, and I did remember my point that I lost before. So I would like to, I think this is a very, very valuable realization. And it came to me kind of because, as I said, I view the world through a material lens. And this sometimes leads to a quite brutal or unforgiving view of the world, because, for example, when you look at human beings simply or mainly through or by their aspect of the animal aspect of their nature, then life is really quite horrible and brutal. Because, for example, when a woman gets old, then she becomes sexually unattractive and also infertile at some point. And in simply the animal nature kind of loses a lot of its value. And the same thing goes for a man, for example, if he is injured in an accident or in a fight and he loses his strength, then he is no longer able to provide for a woman or to be strong and fight, and thereby he would lose a big part of his value in a purely animalistic view of things. And so I think the fact that human beings, for example, have clothes and try to shift the focus primarily onto the moral or rational aspect of a human being and away from the purely animalistic, I think is a very important aspect of kind of making life more bearable, because just the life of animals is absolutely brutal. And this focus on the consciousness and on the rational or moral aspect of a person rather than simply on their animal qualities, I think it makes society much more civilized and more comfortable to live in. And it's just a very important part of what makes life as a human more bearable or better.
Yes, absolutely. It's impossible for human beings to live well without realizing the most important and valuable and noblest part of their essence, which is this dignity and moral value and all that. So yes, I would say this is a very important metaphysical part of reality, and part of reality which is higher than a mere animalistic aspects of reality or things in reality. And also I would maintain that if one asserts that dignity, morality truly exists in reality, then materialism cannot be true, because then these exist as actual metaphysical realities and not simply quantities of matter. So now this would be a very deep metaphysical consideration. That's at least a short statement I would like to make there.
Yes, I think we could go into that another time. I think the statement you made before was just about the perfect end for this conversation, that it is impossible to live well as a human being without accepting the fact that our rational faculty is kind of the highest and most important aspect of being a human being. I think this is just very Aristotelian, and it's just absolutely beautiful point to end on.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. It was it's a great way to formulate this amazing truth, to put it that way.
Yes. So for my point, I don't have anything to add, and I thank you very much for this conversation. I think we have a lot of good conversations, but this one I feel is kind of exceptionally good or important. And so, yes, thank you for this. I hope the audience enjoyed it as well, and I will see you all soon again.
Yes, thank you very much for joining and talking about all these things. Very productive conversation and enlightening. So I enjoyed it very much myself. So yes, I wish you and the audience a great Friday and great weekend.
Great. See you soon. Goodbye.
Goodbye.